The Battle of the Little Bighorn, often referred to as Custer's Last Stand, remains one of the most debated and scrutinized events in American history. For decades, historians, scholars, and enthusiasts have pored over accounts and testimonies, piecing together the fragments of what occurred on that fateful day. Yet, amid all the speculation, one voice often goes unheard, that of the Native American scouts who were there. Today, we delve into the gripping first-hand account of young Hawk, an Iroquois scout who bore witness to the clash between Custer's 7th Cavalry and the united native forces led by Sitting Bull, Crazy Horse, and Gall. Young Hawk's testimony offers a unique and raw perspective on the events that transpired, and his experience stands in stark contrast to the narratives that have long been accepted. As an Iroquois scout, he was tasked with guiding the U.S. Stemverstois cavalry through the rugged terrain of the northern plains, but when the battle erupted, he found himself witnessing one of the bloodiest conflicts between Native Americans and U.S. forces. In his harrowing account, young Hawk describes the build-up to the battle, how tensions simmered as the U.S. Army attempted to force the Lakota, Northern Cheyenne, and Arapaho people onto reservations. The scouts, like young Hawk, were caught between two worlds, often serving under officers like Custer, yet feeling a deep connection to the land and its people. As Custer's regiment approached the native encampment on that fateful morning, young Hawk and his fellow scouts sensed the impending disaster. They had already seen the strength of the native warriors and the resolve of their leaders. Custer, however, was undeterred, pressing forward with a plan that would ultimately lead to his destruction. Young Hawk's account provides chilling details of the battle itself. He describes the chaos and confusion that consumed Custer's forces as they were quickly overwhelmed by the sheer number of native warriors. While popular narratives often depict Custer as a heroic figure making a valiant last stand, young Hawk's testimony paints a far grimmer picture. According to him, the 7th Cavalry was caught off guard, and Custer's strategy, dividing his forces into several smaller units, left his men vulnerable. The native forces, led by such legendary figures as Crazy Horse and Gall, took full advantage of the cavalry's disarray, launching swift and devastating attacks from multiple directions. The speed and precision of the native fighters left the U.S. soldiers little time to regroup or form a cohesive defense. Young Hawk recalled the sight of bodies strewn across the battlefield, the air thick with smoke, and the cries of the wounded. The terrain, which Custer had hoped to use to his advantage, instead became a death trap. Soldiers were cut off, surrounded, and picked off one by the native warriors who knew the land intimately. One of the most striking elements of young Hawk's account is the sense of overconfidence that pervaded Custer's ranks. He mentions how Custer, despite warnings from the scouts and other officers, pressed on with his ill-fated assault. This hubris, young Hawk suggests, was a key factor in the regiment's ultimate defeat. Custer underestimated the strength and coordination of the native forces, believing that his soldiers would easily overpower them. Instead, he walked into a trap from which there would be no escape. As the battle reached its climax, young Hawk observed the complete collapse of the 7th Cavalry. What had begun as a calculated military maneuver quickly devolved into a desperate fight for survival. Custer and his men, once confident in their victory, found themselves outnumbered and outmaneuvered. The famous last stand was not a heroic defense, but rather a frantic and chaotic scramble to survive against overwhelming odds. The army gathered on a small knoll at the base of the hill, where they were soon joined by Custer's group descending from the higher ridge known as the High Butte. There was noticeable tension among the scouts, who anxiously wondered how Custer would react upon hearing that the Dakotas were already aware of his approach. Those scouts who had returned from the hill had relayed the unsettling news of 6 Dakotas they had encountered. As Custer drew nearer, the scouts began to separate into their respective tribal groups, the Iroquois, Crows, and others. The Iroquois scouts, in particular, clustered around their elder men, who addressed the younger warriors following the traditions of their tribe. Stabbed, one of the prominent leaders among the Iroquois scouts, spoke to the younger men, preparing them for what lay ahead. Custer, through his interpreter, Fred Gerard, then communicated his orders to the assembled scouts. "Boys, I want you to go into the Sioux camp and capture their horses," he commanded. Stabbed, taking the role of a mentor, urged the younger Iroquois scouts to heed Custer's instructions and do their best to seize as many horses as possible, emphasizing the importance of the task ahead. This moment exemplified the tense, chaotic buildup to what would become one of the most iconic battles in American history, where warriors and soldiers alike braced for the unknown outcome. Custer continued, igniting a surge of excitement among the scouts. Everyone hastily prepared, tightening their saddle girths and lightening their loads, readying themselves for action. Another bugle blast rang out, and Custer gave the command for the scouts to advance. Descending into the dry coulee, the scouts moved steadily forward. About halfway to the high ridge on their right, young Hawk spotted a group of scouts near the lower end of the ridge, gazing toward a solitary teepee in the distance. Sensing the importance of the moment, the scouts, along with young Hawk's company, began to slow their pace as they neared the others. Suddenly, Gerard's voice came from behind. "The chief orders you to charge." Strikes, too, filled with energy, let out a war whoop, asking, "What are we doing?" before surging forward, his enthusiasm uncontainable as he led the charge into the unknown. At this, we all let out fierce war whoops as Strikes 2 raced ahead, reaching the lone teepee first and striking it with his whip. Young Hawk followed closely behind, dismounting on the north side of the teepee. He drew a knife from his belt and slashed the tent from top to bottom. Inside, he discovered a scaffold bearing a deceased body wrapped in a buffalo robe. Just then, young Hawk noticed Red Star riding alongside him. All the scouts galloped around to the north side of the teepee before veering into the dry coulee beyond. There, they overtook the white soldiers and rode together in a chaotic, fast-moving throng. The most skilled riders among the scouts kept pace with the soldiers, while others gradually fell behind. They crossed through a prairie dog village at the mouth of the coulee, turned sharply to the right, and young Hawk spotted Red Star, Goose, Boy Chief, and Red Bear on the west side of the Little Bighorn. Sensing that his end was near and fearing that the Dakotas would scalp him, young Hawk made a symbolic preparation for what he believed would be his final moments. He unbraided his hair, tying it forward with a cluster of loose eagle feathers, a traditional gesture of readiness for death. Despite the ominous feeling hanging over him, he steeled himself for the worst. The battle began suddenly, with skirmishes erupting at the front line. Soldiers and scouts quickly dismounted, each holding their horses behind them as they braced for the fight. The soldiers formed a line stretching from right to left, while the scouts positioned themselves on either side, scattered along the ridges for cover. The scouts, far from being a tight-knit group, were spaced out, each adapting to the rugged terrain as best they could. Bob-tailed Bull stood furthest out, closest to the ridge, a lone figure facing the approaching enemy. Meanwhile, Dakota skirmishers, riding on horseback, weaved back and forth in front of the line, testing the resolve of the soldiers and scouts alike. Young Hawk, understanding the gravity of the situation, shifted to the right to take his place among his fellow scouts. They stood in a loose formation, each warrior aware that the coming moments could be their last. From his vantage point, young Hawk observed how the scouts were arranged. To his left stood Red Bear, followed by Little Brave, Forked Horn, Red Foolish Bear, Goose, Big Belly, Crow, Strike's Enemy Crow, and far out on the left flank, Bob-tailed Bull, who remained stationed at the farthest edge of the line, near the ridge. Young Hawk positioned himself between Goose and Big Belly, ready to face whatever the Dakotas would throw at them. There was a sense of quiet determination among the scouts. Each man knew the odds were against them, yet they held their ground. The Dakotas, renowned for their speed and tactical brilliance, circled before them on horseback, keeping the soldiers and scouts on edge with their constant, unpredictable movements. The battle grew fiercer as the Dakota warriors intensified their skirmishes, but the scouts remained steadfast, each one anchored to their position. Young Hawk, with his hair loose and feathers tied forward, stood resolute. His thoughts, though heavy with the possibility of death, were focused on the present, on the fight unfolding before his eyes. The scouts fought with skill and courage, though outnumbered and outflanked. Each man, from Bob-tailed Bull to Goose and Big Belly, held the line against the Dakota fighters. The terrain worked both for and against them, offering some cover, but also isolating the scouts from one another. The battle raged on, the air thick with dust and the smell of gunpowder. The Dakotas, expert horsemen and relentless warriors, tested every weakness in the soldiers' and scouts' defenses. At times, they seemed to vanish into the landscape, only to reappear in a whirlwind of mounted attacks. Young Hawk, though under immense pressure, stayed alert. He watched as the soldiers fired, the scouts repositioned, and the Dakota riders shifted with lightning speed. As the fight wore on, young Hawk's earlier preparation for death seemed less like a surrender to fate and more like a final act of defiance. He had readied himself not for failure, but for the possibility of victory, or, at the very least, a worthy stand. His position among the scouts reflected his acceptance of whatever outcome awaited them, whether it be survival or sacrifice. In those moments, with the battle raging around him and his fellow scouts at his side, young Hawk became part of the legendary fight that would later be remembered as one of the defining moments of the Great Sioux War. Though the odds were stacked against them, the scouts held their ground, embodying the warrior's code of facing death with honor, courage, and an unbreakable will to resist. As the battle raged on, Bloody Knife suddenly appeared from the distance, making his way directly toward me. His arrival was striking, not just because of the intensity of the moment, but because of his distinctive attire. Draped around his neck was a black handkerchief adorned with blue stars, a gift he had received from Custer himself. Alongside the handkerchief, a bear's claw and clamshell hung from his neck, symbols of his warrior status. Despite the chaos around us, Bloody Knife spoke clearly and with purpose. Custer's orders about the Sioux horses are being carried out. The horses are being seized. Without waiting for a response, he moved behind the line and took his place beside Little Brave. In that instant, I saw an opportunity. The sorrel horse, now riderless, was still moving toward us. Without hesitation, I moved quickly to intercept it. The moment the horse came close, I claimed it as my own. A sense of triumph surged through me, though it was tinged with the grim reality of the battlefield. Horses were valuable in both battle and survival, and securing one in the midst of combat felt like a small victory in an otherwise overwhelming situation. I turned to Red Bear, who was nearby, and shouted to him, offering him the horse I had just claimed. But to my surprise, Red Bear didn't respond or make any move to claim the horse for himself. Whether he was too focused on the battle or simply didn't hear me over the roar of gunfire, I couldn't be sure. The moment passed quickly, and the horse remained in my possession. As I looked around, the battle continued to spiral into chaos. The Dakota warriors were relentless, pressing forward with unyielding force, while our soldiers struggled to maintain their positions. Despite the dire situation, the scouts remained steadfast, refusing to abandon the field. Bloody Knife, standing beside Little Brave, exchanged glances with me from across the line. His presence was both reassuring and grim, a reminder of the unpredictable fate that awaited all of us. The line, once strong and organized, had become a desperate collection of soldiers and scouts trying to hold their ground. The enemy surged forward, their warriors displaying incredible courage and tactical prowess. Every moment felt like a delicate balance between survival and death, and each of us knew that the outcome was far from certain. In that fierce and chaotic struggle, the personal actions of each man, whether it was seizing a horse, holding the line, or taking down an enemy, felt like small but critical moments that contributed to the larger fight. The Dakota warrior who had charged so fearlessly only to be struck down was a powerful reminder of the cost of war. His sorrel horse, now mine, seemed almost a symbol of the fleeting nature of life on the battlefield. As the battle wore on, I kept the horse close, knowing that every advantage could make the difference between life and death. The soldiers continued to fall, and the retreat grew more pressing by the minute. Yet through it all, the scouts, myself included, held firm. Bloody Knife's earlier words about the Sioux horses being seized rang in my ears, reminding me that even amidst the chaos, we still had a mission to carry out. But the battle was far from over, and though the line had bent back toward the river, we knew that the coming hours would determine our fate. Each man was prepared to fight to the last, and the sight of that fallen Dakota warrior, along with the horse I now claimed, would remain etched in my memory long after the final shot was fired. Instead of Red Bear, it was Big Belly, a Crow Indian, who approached me. He said, "Brother, I desire this horse. Give it to me." Big Belly, also known as Half Yellow Face, was a close friend of mine, and I respected his request. Without hesitation, I handed over the reins of the captured Dakota horse. Big Belly eagerly took the steed, releasing his own inferior mount in exchange. He swiftly mounted the Dakota horse, preparing for the battle that was intensifying around us. As we made this exchange, the Dakotas were gathering in force behind the ridge nearest to Bob-tailed Bull, who stood far out on the left flank. The tension in the air grew heavier with each passing second. Suddenly, a dense throng of Dakota warriors surged over the ridge, charging toward Bob-tailed Bull in a powerful, unified mass. Their war cries filled the air as they descended upon him, their sheer numbers overwhelming. As we fell back, the retreat became chaotic. The soldiers and scouts alike moved as one, trying to hold their positions as long as possible, but ultimately retreating across the river. The retreat path took us approximately 2 miles downstream, a desperate dash to escape the advancing Dakota forces. Once we reached the river, we crossed it and headed for higher ground. The crossing was frantic, with everyone aware of the danger still close behind. On the other side, we traversed the flatland and began ascending the bluff at a diagonal. The climb was grueling, made all the more difficult by the weight of exhaustion and the knowledge that the Dakotas could press their attack at any moment. The soldiers led the way during the climb, with the scouts following close behind. Big Belly, still mounted on the captured Dakota horse, kept pace, his new steed proving far superior to the one he had abandoned. Alongside him was Strike's enemy, another Crow scout, both of them pressing forward with determined resolve. The rest of the scouts followed, Red Foolish Bear, Forked Horn, Goose, and myself, Young Hawk, bringing up the rear. As we ascended the bluff, the battlefield behind us became a distant, hazy memory of chaos and violence. The Dakotas, though powerful, had not yet crossed the river in pursuit, giving us a brief moment of reprieve. The climb was steep and exhausting, but we knew that reaching the top of the bluff would give us a much-needed vantage point and a brief opportunity to regroup. Every step felt like a battle of its own. The weight of fatigue bore down on us, but we pressed on. The soldiers, scouts, and Crows, now united in their desperation, kept moving, knowing that survival depended on reaching the top of the bluff. I glanced over at Big Belly as we climbed, grateful that he had taken the better horse. His friendship and bravery had been a constant throughout the battle, and seeing him ride ahead gave me a renewed sense of determination. Without hesitation, Young Hawk leapt from his horse, ready to face the enemy. Goose, his fellow scout, quickly followed suit. The two of them raised their weapons and fired at the advancing Dakotas, their shots echoing through the chaos of battle. They didn't stop moving. Instead, they kept their horses in motion, shooting as they advanced. The Dakotas, caught off guard by the scouts' determined resistance, turned back, momentarily retreating from their charge. Bob-tailed Bull, who had been on the verge of being overwhelmed, took advantage of this moment of reprieve. He managed to cross the river near the soldiers' fort, escaping the immediate danger that had been closing in on him. It was a brief but critical success in a battle that offered few such moments. Young Hawk, still in the thick of the fight, quickly attempted to reload his carbine, intending to fire again at the retreating Dakotas. But in the heat of the moment, his hand slipped, and he dropped the shell needed to load his weapon. Frustration surged through him as he fumbled to recover, knowing every second counted. Yet the momentum of the battle carried him forward. The time for another shot had passed, and he had to move.
At that point, 4 of the other scouts, Half Yellow Face, Strike's enemy, Red Foolish Bear, and Forked Horn, had already made the decision to press forward and escape. They rode into the thick brush, a natural cover that shielded them from the eyes of their pursuers. From there, they made their way to the river, choosing to cross it farther downstream, where the water was slightly shallower and the cover of the brush was denser. The crossing point was less than 1/8 of a mile away, but the path was treacherous. Seeing this, Goose and Young Hawk wasted no time. They spurred their horses into motion, following the others through the dense brush. The thick undergrowth snagged at their clothing and their horses' legs, but they pressed forward, determined to reach the riverbank and cross to safety. The sound of rushing water grew louder as they approached the crossing point. When they finally reached the river, the real challenge began. The water was deep and swift, made worse by the weight of their gear and the pressure of the ongoing battle. Their horses, exhausted from the intense fighting, struggled in the current. The animals fought to find their footing, their legs sinking into the riverbed as they strained to reach the opposite bank. Young Hawk could feel the tension in every muscle of his horse as it fought to swim through the river's depths. The water surged against them, cold and unforgiving, and for a brief moment, it felt as though they might not make it across. But young Hawk held tight, urging his horse forward with every ounce of strength he had left. Goose, right beside him, was battling the same struggle, both men keenly aware that failure here could mean death. After what felt like an eternity, their horses finally found solid ground on the opposite bank. Young Hawk and Goose, drenched and exhausted, emerged from the river, grateful to have made it to safety. They navigated their horses through the last of the brush, joining the other scouts who had already crossed. On the other side, they paused for a moment, catching their breath and taking stock of the situation. They had managed to escape the immediate threat of the Dakotas, but the battle was far from over. The river had given them temporary refuge, but the fight would continue on the other side. Young Hawk and Goose faced each other amidst the chaos, their breath quick and ragged from the exertion of battle. Suddenly, Goose let out a low groan, his face contorted in pain. "Cousin," he said, his voice strained, "I am wounded." The sight of his friend's suffering stirred something deep within young Hawk. In that moment, his resolve hardened, and he silently vowed to fight to the death if it came to that. This was no longer a battle for survival alone, it was personal. Goose revealed his right hand, bloodied and wounded from a Dakota bullet. He struggled to unfasten his cartridge belt, and without hesitation, young Hawk reached out and took it for him. He strapped the belt around his own waist, his mind focused on the immediate danger. Every move he made was deliberate, each action calculated with the grim awareness that time was running out. As he stood beside Goose's horse, he knew their options were limited. Young Hawk positioned Goose against the base of a sturdy tree, giving him what little shelter he could. "Hold the horse," he instructed, though the animal was restless, unnerved by the sound of gunfire. As Goose leaned against the tree, clutching his wounded hand, young Hawk scanned their surroundings. It was then that he noticed Half-Yellowface crawling toward them, his face grim and determined despite the danger they were all in. "My friend is being slain," Half-Yellowface cried out, his voice strained with urgency. "He lies just at the thicket's edge." Young Hawk's heart sank at the words. Somewhere, one of their comrades was fighting his last battle. The thought of it sent a shiver down his spine, but there was no time to dwell on it. Survival was all that mattered now. The Dakotas continued to fire into the grove, their shots growing more erratic as they circled the trees. Young Hawk kept low, using the thick trunks for cover. He could hear the cries of the Dakotas and the sound of their horses moving through the brush, but the dense trees made it difficult to see where they were. It felt as though they were surrounded on all sides, the enemy invisible yet ever present. Young Hawk's thoughts raced. He knew they couldn't stay in the grove forever. The Dakotas would close in eventually. He glanced at Goose, who was pale and weakening from his wound. The fear in his cousin's eyes mirrored the same dread he felt, but young Hawk refused to let it consume him. He couldn't afford to give in to fear, not now. He had to think, to find a way out. "Stay low," he whispered to Goose, his voice steady despite the chaos. "We'll find a way out of this." Goose nodded, his breath coming in shallow gasps as he tried to steady himself. Meanwhile, Half-Yellowface, Strike's enemy, and the others had regrouped, their eyes scanning the perimeter of the grove. They knew they couldn't hold out much longer, but none of them were ready to give up. Young Hawk could see the determination etched on their faces. This wasn't just about survival anymore. It was about protecting each other, about making sure that as many of them as possible lived to see another day. Determined to provide cover for his comrades, young Hawk made the dangerous decision to crawl out of the shelter of the trees and expose himself to the enemy. He moved slowly, stealthily, his body low to the ground as he inched toward a new firing position. When he reached a suitable spot, he stood and took aim at the Sioux warriors who were kneeling in the distance, their rifles trained on the grove. With a steady hand, young Hawk fired, his shot ringing out across the battlefield. Almost immediately, the Sioux responded with a volley of gunfire, bullets whizzing past him, but miraculously, he emerged unscathed. It was a narrow escape, but it didn't shake his resolve. Instead, it only strengthened his determination. He had managed to draw the enemy's fire away from his wounded comrades, even if only for a brief moment, and that was enough to keep him going. Without missing a beat, young Hawk crawled to a new location, once again putting himself in harm's way. He fired another shot, and once again, the Sioux answered with a volley of bullets. This time, the shots came even closer, the sound of gunfire deafening as bullets struck the ground around him. But young Hawk was quick. He dropped to the ground, disappearing from sight before the enemy could hit him. As he lay low, scanning the battlefield for his next move, his eyes caught sight of a large tree nearby, with driftwood piled against its base. It looked like a potential safe haven, a place where he could take cover and plan his next move. Crawling on his belly, he made his way to the tree, careful to stay out of the Sioux's line of sight. When he reached the driftwood pile, young Hawk paused, taking a moment to catch his breath and assess the situation. That's when he noticed something lying just a few feet away from him. At first, he thought it was another fallen comrade, but as he crawled closer, he realized it was Forked Horn. The scout was lying face down, pressed flat against the ground, trying to make himself as small a target as possible. Forked Horn hadn't been hit, but he was doing everything he could to avoid the deadly hail of bullets. The gunfire continued, the Dakotas relentless in their pursuit, but young Hawk's mind was clear. He had made it this far, and he wasn't about to give up now. His comrades were counting on him, and the thought of leaving any of them behind was unthinkable. As he crouched behind the tree, sheltered by the driftwood, he prepared for what would come next. The battle was far from over, but young Hawk had no intention of backing down. He had already faced death multiple times that day, and each time, he had emerged stronger, more determined. With his comrades wounded and the Dakotas closing in, he knew that the next few moments would be critical. But young Hawk was ready. He would fight to the end, no matter what it took. As the attack subsided, young Hawk took a moment to gather his thoughts and observations. He noticed the Dakotas moving downstream, an indication that Custer's forces might have launched their assault on the lower fort. Scanning the horizon, he could see many Dakotas crossing the river, heading northward, their movements precise and purposeful. The sight reaffirmed his suspicions that the battle was evolving, with Custer's engagement shifting the focus of the conflict. When the gunfire began to die down, young Hawk cautiously stood up to get a better view. His eyes were drawn to a United States flag fluttering atop the ridge above, a beacon that marked the location of the pack train. It was a small but significant sight, offering a glimpse of hope in the tumult of the battlefield. Forked Horn, witnessing young Hawk's keen observations and bravery, turned to him with admiration. "My grandson, you have proven yourself the bravest," he said, pride swelling in his voice. "But we must now strive to reach the pack train, as Custer instructed, to avoid being mistaken for Dakotas." The urgency in his tone reminded young Hawk of their precarious position and the importance of distinguishing themselves from the enemy. Determined to ensure their safety, young Hawk quickly devised a plan. He took off his white handkerchief and tied it to a stick, creating a makeshift flag that would signal their identity and intentions. The flag flapped gently in the breeze, a symbol of their desire to avoid further conflict. With their plan in motion, the group worked together to mount Strike's enemy on his own horse, despite his wounds to both his leg and hand. The effort was slow and careful, each member of the team doing their part to ensure he was secure in the saddle. Goose, seeing the urgency of their situation, mounted Red Foolish Bear's horse, while Red Foolish Bear himself went on foot, his determination undeterred by the chaos around them. With the makeshift flag in hand, young Hawk rode ahead of the group, his heart pounding as he held the white flag high. It was a simple gesture, yet it carried the weight of their collective resolve. As he pushed forward, he remained acutely aware of the surrounding dangers, every rustle in the underbrush reminding him of the unpredictability of battle. Young Hawk's determination to reach the pack train surged within him, a drive fueled by the hope of safety and solidarity amidst the chaos. As he navigated through the treacherous terrain, he kept an eye out for any signs of Custer's forces, ready to alert his companions to their presence. The journey was fraught with tension, But young Hawk pressed on, committed to fulfilling his duty to his comrades and ensuring their survival. The makeshift flag fluttered above him, a testament to their resilience and the bond they shared in the face of adversity. As the group descended the stream and climbed the steep slope, young Hawk's heart raced with urgency. The air was thick with tension as they neared the ridge. Suddenly, they caught sight of the Dakotas returning on the east side of the ridge, their numbers swarming toward the white camp like a dark wave crashing toward the shore. It became clear that the battle with Custer had reached a devastating conclusion. The Dakotas had overwhelmed the hill where the soldiers made their final stand. Realizing the perilous situation, the party hesitated. They exchanged anxious glances, understanding that their survival now depended on a quick retreat. One by one, they turned back, the instinct for self-preservation taking hold. All except young Hawk. A surge of determination coursed through him as he resolved to hold his ground. Gripping the makeshift white flag tightly, he stood defiantly against the encroaching chaos. The sound of gunfire rang out as soldiers began firing over him at the advancing enemy. Young Hawk could feel the bullets whizzing past him, a stark reminder of the danger he was in. Despite the overwhelming odds, he refused to waver, his spirit unbroken even as the Dakotas began to target him specifically. They saw the white flag he held, a symbol of his intentions, yet the frenzy of battle made no distinction between friend and foe. Suddenly, the crack of a gunshot pierced the air, and young Hawk felt a violent jolt as his horse was struck down beneath him. The animal collapsed, throwing him off and landing hard beside him. Adrenaline surged as he sprang to his feet, still clutching the flag that represented hope and peace amidst the chaos. Without a moment's hesitation, he dashed toward the camp, knowing that he needed to reach safety and provide any information he could about the ongoing battle. As he raced into the camp, the scene was one of frantic activity. Soldiers hurried about, tending to the wounded and preparing for the next wave of conflict. Amidst the tumult, young Hawk spotted Peaked Face, the chief of scouts, and Varnum, a high-ranking officer, who both turned their attention to him with looks of concern and relief. With his new mount secured, young Hawk felt a renewed sense of purpose. He understood that survival wasn't just about saving oneself. It was about honoring those who had fought and fallen, about rallying the living to continue the fight. He was ready to face whatever came next, knowing that the spirit of his fallen comrades would guide him as he prepared to stand with his fellow soldiers against the encroaching storm. Time became a blur as the intense fighting continued without pause, the desperate struggle stretching on until darkness fell over the ravine. The sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows that danced ominously along the ground. As night descended, the adrenaline of battle gave way to a grim reality. The wounded were tended to with whatever limited supplies were available, while the dead were laid aside, their sacrifices marked by the silence that enveloped the scene. With darkness settling around them, the troops stayed vigilant throughout the night, the threat of a Dakota attack looming large in their minds. Eyes scanned the shadows, ears tuned to every rustle and whisper of the wind. The night was heavy with anticipation, the air thick with anxiety as they prepared for the possibility of another onslaught. Young Hawk felt a mixture of fear and determination as he clutched his makeshift shield, the weight of his duty pressing down on him. He thought of his fallen comrades and those still fighting alongside him, drawing strength from their shared resolve. Despite the darkness that enveloped them, a flicker of hope remained alive in his heart, a guiding light in the face of overwhelming odds. As the hours dragged on, the tension in the air remained unbroken, each soldier lost in their thoughts, preparing for whatever might come with the dawn. They shared unspoken bonds of brotherhood forged in the crucible of battle, knowing that their survival hinged on their unity and determination to fight for one another. In that ravine, amidst the chaos and fear, young Hawk found a sense of purpose, ready to face the challenges that lay ahead, come what may. At dawn, as the first light broke over the horizon, the eerie stillness was shattered by the crack of gunfire. A few shots rang out, signaling the resumption of the battle with a renewed ferocity that would last until late afternoon. The tension among the soldiers was palpable as they steeled themselves for another day of conflict. The scouts, having regrouped on the side closest to the Dakota lines and the ridge, found themselves in a precarious position, acutely aware of the dangers that lay ahead. During the early afternoon, an officer approached the scouts with a weighty message. His expression was grave, underscoring the importance of the task at hand. He conveyed that the message was to be delivered after dark, an indication of the urgency and delicacy of the situation. Forkthorn, always the steady leader, acknowledged the request with a nod, and the officer informed Goose, who was visibly struggling with his injuries, that he would not be able to participate due to the extent of his wounds. Despite his condition, Goose insisted on carrying out the mission, declaring that he would share the same fate as his fellow scouts. His determination resonated deeply within the group, showcasing the indomitable spirit that characterized the scouts. They were bound by a sense of loyalty and duty that transcended their individual struggles. The officer, recognizing Goose's fierce resolve, conceded but cautioned that the task ahead was fraught with peril. As the afternoon wore on, the officer returned with a sergeant, explaining that this man would accompany them to ensure that, should the worst occur and all the scouts be killed, the camp's situation would still be known to those in charge. The sergeant's presence was a stark reminder of the gravity of their mission. Each scout understood the importance of the message they were tasked to deliver. It was destined for the President of the United States, aimed at informing the highest authorities of the events that had transpired on the battlefield. The weight of this mission hung heavily in the air. Each scout felt the immense responsibility that came with such a task. It was not merely a message about their fight. It was a testament to their bravery and a call for recognition of their sacrifices. Young Hawk, despite the chaos around him, contemplated the significance of what they were about to undertake. This message was not just words, it represented the voices of fallen comrades, the cries of the wounded, and the determination of those still standing. As the battle raged on, the scouts moved cautiously, each step laden with the potential for danger. They took their positions, ready to fulfill their duty, even as the sounds of gunfire echoed relentlessly in the distance. The landscape around them was a stark reminder of the brutality of war, the ground littered with the remnants of conflict. The camaraderie among the scouts was palpable, their shared experiences forging bonds that would last a lifetime. As the sun hung low in the sky, casting long shadows across the battlefield, the urgency of their mission pressed upon them. They prepared to deliver the message, aware that their actions would ripple far beyond the confines of the ravine. Each scout understood the implications. They were not just fighting for their own survival, but for the future of their people, for the truth to be heard, and for their bravery to be acknowledged. Young Hawk glanced at Goose, whose determination remained steadfast despite his wounds. The unyielding spirit of the scouts surged within him, a reminder that they were all in this together. They would face whatever came next with courage and resolve, knowing that their mission was one of honor, a testament to their commitment to their comrades and their cause. With the weight of their mission settled firmly on their shoulders, the scouts braced themselves for what lay ahead, ready to carry forth their message into the heart of uncertainty. The scouts were permitted to ride government horses, faster than their own mounts, as they prepared for a mission fraught with peril. They were instructed to ride hard, disregarding any cries for help from those who might be shot by the Dakotas. In the unfortunate event that a scout was wounded or fell, they were to leave the message paper on the ground, ensuring that the soldiers would later find it and understand the dire situation unfolding around them. Recognizing the importance of speed, Forkthorn suggested that the shoes be removed from the government horses, believing they would run better without the added weight. The decision highlighted the urgency of their task, as every second counted in the face of the relentless enemy. Once the messages were meticulously prepared, 2 Crow Scouts opted to stay behind. One was wounded and needed care, while the other chose to remain by his side. The group of messengers consisted of Goose, Forkthorn, Red Foolish Bear, Young Hawk, and the White Sergeant, all resolute and ready to embark on their dangerous journey. As night descended, casting shadows across the landscape, they cautiously followed the ravine out, their hearts pounding with the gravity of their mission. However, the danger was immediate and real. As they made their way, the Dakotas lay in wait, ambushing them unexpectedly. The sudden assault forced the scouts into a hasty retreat, their earlier confidence shattered by the harsh reality of war. Adrenaline surged through their veins as they quickly regrouped, understanding that the fight was far from over and their survival depended on their speed and teamwork.